Thanks for coming. So, a glutton for punishment, talk number 2, I guess, here. And how many folks in the room have done a large public venue? Okay, yeah, I thought so. So thanks for coming over here, and hopefully some of you have seen maybe a few slides of this material. We've started to push a little bit of this out into the public domain. But if you've seen this before, I've got some new material that you may find of interest, and if you haven't, you'll find all of it hopefully interesting. So we'll talk about the overview, just kind of a quick overview of the deployment, run through a little bit of the system design, the RF design, talk about the SSID and authentication design. From there, go into some stats, talk about the Picocell environment, and some things we could have done a little better, and some things that worked out the way we hoped that they would. And I'll take questions. This is not going to be quite as rushed as yesterday's session was, so if you've got questions as we go, just please speak up. So, kind of summary of the deployment. Anybody been to Levi's for a game? Okay. So this is the venue. If you've ever been to Candlestick, you know it's night and day kind of difference. It's a pretty modern design. It's basically an office tower parked next to a half bowl. And as you can imagine, the tower, they're trying to maximize the skybox suite revenue opportunity, right? So there's a significant number of suites in the tower in kind of a compact form factor, and then there's also all the way around the in the level 5 here are about another 100 suites. So there's 170 suites total in the venue. A couple of facts and figures. About 68.5 expandable to so this Super Bowl 50 will be there in about a year, and they're going to expand it by another 7,000 seats or so to meet the NFL minimums. About $1 billion budget, 10 different clubs on site of varying sizes and locations, about 370 concessions with a mix of wired and wireless point of sale. The wired network here is like no other wired network you will ever see at a stadium. Brocade is one of the sponsors of the venue, and one of the clubs is the Brocade Club on the east side. So there are far more switches. The switch economics were very favorable, I guess, in this deployment would be a way to put it. So it's almost like a campus deployment. There's 52 IDFs, and I mean 24,000 switch ports. It's really remarkable. About 400 miles of cabling. There are approximately 1,200 of our AP225 access points deployed and we'll talk about where they are. This is also our first significant beacon deployment. We introduced a Bluetooth low energy product, and there's somewhere north of 1,200 beacons distributed around the facility, which we use for the wayfinding application. About 2,000 IPTVs in the venue, and a really huge scoreboard, which is on the network. Another thing that a lot of people probably heard about is the app. Apps are sort of all the rage, and people have different opinions about them, but the 49ers, as you'll see, really wanted to change the entire experience of interacting with the game, and a lot of teams sort of talk about that, but this app is probably the most deeply woven app that I've seen deployed in any venue yet, and we're really not going to spend a lot of time on the app because I want to keep the focus on the network, but it really is pretty remarkable in how it's woven into everything that they're doing. There's wayfinding integrated into it that uses the beacon information to look at a local database and do, in effect, real-time blue dot, or we call it green dot. It's if the device is using GPS. So if you're in the parking lot or if you're in an outside area where the GPS the system sees it as more accurate, it'll go green dot, but very, very snappy, very, very responsive. Food ordering, so the 49ers kind of wanted every seat to be a VIP seat, so you can have food come directly to you. You can do it the old-fashioned way, walk up, order, wait for it, or there's also, they have express lines, right? So you can order from the seat and then have it ready, you just show your phone and you just walk away with it to cut the time down. So the express and the in-seat ordering obviously are carried over the Wi-Fi, so that has to work. And we do about 2,500, 2,600 orders per game. And the in-seat delivery they do in about 8 minutes. And then there's content, stats, video, kind of the usual package. But when I talk about the Niners kind of wanting to reimagine the experience, so it starts literally at the gate. So they actually built their own ticketing hardware for the venue. So when you come in, they wanted to change the whole experience of coming into the venue where you hand the ticket taker the ticket, and then they do the fumble thing with the scanner, right? And it takes time and so on. So they wanted to speed up the queues. They wanted to change the dynamics. So the way it works now is you walk up, the person standing behind the line is a greeter. They're welcoming you to the stadium. They're looking you in the eye. They're welcoming you, and then you put your own ticket or phone. So it's an NFC reader, it's a QR code reader, and so on. You put it into the little red slot. And you do your own scan and you go on through. And it's very, very fast. The app is quick. But of course, Ticketmaster is behind the scenes. So they basically built their own front end in front of Ticketmaster, which gives them this very fast queue management. But it also gives them all the data, because normally Ticketmaster retains all of that information, and they're not too good about sharing it. A lot of people in the room have done venues, so you're familiar with this. So from my perspective, from a Wi-Fi perspective, obviously ticketing gates are a critical application, but there were some unknowns around this device, particularly how it performed on the network, that we weren't clear about up front, but it turned out to be pretty good. Some screenshots of the app with wayfinding. You can see the kind of the blue dot here, and wayfinding is actually woven into the application. It's not just get me from here to here. So a lot of the content is dynamic based on where you are in the facility. So the food, for example, it actually will come up. The menus are built dynamically. You get the 3 concessions that are closest to you in the venue, whether you're doing express or whether you're doing in-seat delivery. And then there's a video replay function. There's both a kind of a static game channel, and then there's on-demand replays. And so they've got 4 different views plus kind of a quad view. And the entitlement for the video is actually also done with the Bluetooth. So that's how we determine if you are in the stadium and we can show you the video or not. So the wayfinding is kind of baked into it at all kinds of different levels, and it's very seamless to the user. Okay, system design. So how many are you familiar with the Aruba cluster design? Okay, about half. So I'll just summarize this kind of at a high level. So basically, there are 6 production controllers. 2 are what we call masters, which are basically a control plane, and 4 are what we call local controllers. And those are, a local is basically just a controller that terminates AP traffic and terminates user traffic. APs are grouped into separate pairs, and these are separate failover pairs. Everything in the stadium is a 1+1 HA design, and so we can, there's half of these are primary to one and half are standby to the other, and then there's a variety of enabling servers down here that we'll talk more about. And this is what it looks like in the data center. So cores are here, controllers are here. They're running Junis for firewalls. Northbound from the service clusters. And the WAN pipe, as you may have heard, is there's 40 gigabits coming out of the stadium. It's 20 gig from 2 different providers, and Comcast is also a sponsor, so the Wi-Fi is branded. It's Xfinity Wi-Fi. As I mentioned, Brocade is the wired, or one of the sponsors of the event, so there's a lot of Brocade equipment in this facility. And basically the way to kind of read the diagram is, so these are all the edge connections. Again, there are 52 IDFs, there are 48 actually in the building, and then there's 4 satellite IDFs in parking lots and things of that nature. So every IDF is connected via 10 gig dual home connections, 40 gig up to the edge, and then I'll come to this a little later, but this was not the first DHCP server that was installed. So we're running the InfoBlocks product now, which was kind of the recommendation we gave them after the original Linux servers flamed out. The controllers are look like that, stack of controllers. So again, two masters on top, 4 locals, and there are 2 lab controllers. And so that just a little bit about the scaling. So the reason, so why 4 local controllers? The stadium again seats 68,000 people. The hard target for capacity from an association capacity perspective was 50%, but the soft target was 100%, right? So which we rounded down to 65K. So the this controller model, the 7240, is rated for 32K users, right? And I can only load it halfway with a 1+1 configuration. So I need 4 controllers in order to meet that specification. So that's the reason for that number of controllers. There's a rack of server equipment. Again, Tor and Bohr switches connected, similar to what you'd see in a closet. And then everything's clustered. So we're running Airwave 4, which is our management platform. ClearPass, which I'll talk about, which is essentially our AAA environment and also a guest management function. And there are 49ers app servers that are also directly on the FAN network. And these are primarily serving the HLS requests. The video is implemented. It's all unicast video, which you'll see in the config because there's no multicast in this environment. And the video is all done via HLS. So there's a stack of servers answering the HTTP requests, right? And then the video is all stored in a satellite data center next to the video control room. And they're using Elemental servers, which is the same hardware, actually, that, anyway, so Elemental is the kind of the source of all the video in the system. So when you play a replay, you're going here, and then it's going here. Radio design. So it's a series of orthogonal blankets in the sort of standard way. I'm sure you all know it's a Pico design. So this is kind of an oversimplified description, but basically the Picos are facing up underneath the seats, and I'll show you a photo of that here in a second. The suites are basically every other suite, and that turned out to be a good density. And then the concourses are handled essentially facing the opposite direction, and I'll show you some pictures of that. And then the third ring, and I sort of visualize this as a bullseye with a series of rings around it, right? And then the perimeter coverage is all outbound. So, I've tried to minimize the layers, and a lot of hands earlier, so you guys have been in the chair. As you know, you want to leverage the structure to the maximum extent you possibly can to create isolation between the blankets.
Chuck, if you had the opportunity to go below the seats but above the concrete or under the concrete, which would you choose?
If you have the ability to go above the concrete, it's definitely better. Yeah.
Does that limit your isolation,
Yes. Sorry. So the first question was, do we have a preference for below or above the concrete? And so that was my answer a minute ago. And I was doing below concrete a long time ago, and it's evolved through the years. I worked on it with a few folks in the room. But I think what's very clear from, certainly I could say with pretty high confidence now that we do not have a propagation problem. In fact, I'll be showing you some data on spatial reuse, and it's really good. It's very, very good. Yeah. Okay, so 6 different install types. So obviously indoor, under seat, a couple different flavors of that, directionals. Again, you guys know the drill. There's no single AP mounting strategy that works, particularly when you have different coverage strategies inside the same facility.
What are you using for the Type B? Is that the external antenna or just the AP?
Yeah, so the question is what's in the box? So these are all, anytime you see these boxes that are plastic, it's going to be a 225. I'll give you a little better picture of the under seat view here in just a second. And then it's a 224 in the stainless boxes.
Hey Jeff, can you go back to type A? It looks like you have that sitting on a box on the ceiling instead of mounted on the T-rail. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, that's our, yes. So the question is it's not mounted to the T-rail. Why? And architects don't like things on T-rails. They consider it unclean. So they wanted everything in the center of the tile. And so that's just a wall mount kit. And they just punched a hole, right, and put a bracket behind it, clamped it, right, and stamped on it. It is a much nicer looking finish, I must say, than the T-rail. This is the original Picocell layout. In practice, I ended up with something that was far less organized, just due to structural stuff and where they could do cores and that sort of thing. But I've got 650 cores through the concrete in the bowl. So of the 1,200 APs, about 650 are actually in the bowl, and the 550 remainder are everywhere else. But this was the original design. So in effect, there are between 5 and 6 APs per section. So it's about, the cells were designed to be, and we'll talk more about this later, but essentially 20 seats across by about 8 rows up and down. And to kind of go back to your question, I would say that if anything, they're smaller than that is what we find in terms of the SNR that we want. On average, there's 1 cell for every 100 seats. And the next time I go out, I'll probably tighten that up a little bit. What we have works very well, but we did tremendous studies of crowd loss in different venues. We've been doing Pico for years, and I was surprised by what we're seeing here is we see much more loss than we had seen in other environments. I guess it's the best way to describe it. So here's a little better close-up of the box. So yeah, it's a 225 on one of our little plastic X mounts that's just sitting just on the bottom of the box. You've got the core here, right, a little length of flex height. And we do meet the 20 centimeter minimum, but out of an abundance of caution, we actually did the SAR test as well. And the manufacturers are not required to do SAR tests because the APs, the equipment's not intended to be within 20 centimeters of human tissue. But if people are doing handrail deployments, we're going under seats, so it's you can calculate it, and the numbers all look good on paper, but there's no substitute for actually having a test report. So we did that, and as you'd expect, considering the power of that's in mobile phones these days on the Wi-Fi radios, and those vendors are required to do SAR testing, and they pass every time, right? So that really, it's not something that we've ever had any concern about, and it's not really come up with any. So far, nobody's actually asked about it.
Jeff,
yes.
Have you had any problems with beer or other substances being spilled on enclosures?
The question is beer or other unclean substances. Yeah, no problems so far, but.
Don't they power wash those too periodically?
They do power wash them, yeah. So it's a IP68, 67 rated enclosure, and we did train the installers to hopefully get them all right. I didn't personally inspect everyone, but actually the problem.
Everybody in the room's aware.
Yeah, no.
That
Well,
being a problem.
yeah, power washing is the normal way that it's cleaned in this country, but it does vary from country to country. So for example, in Spain, there's no alcohol served at soccer matches, right? So the stadiums in Spain are cleaned with blowers. It's really, so it differs from country to country. Anyway, this next shot will give you some sense of the scale. So this was obviously as they were putting the seats in. It's a little easier to sort of get a sense of the density. So these are all APs, and obviously it's a little less regular than the plan I showed you, and it's a little more honeycombed in this shot. But very, very dense deployment. This is what the Picos look from behind. So there's conduit runs, right, that come up to a ag box and then off to the nearest IDF. And then they come through. Actually, so the problem we've had is I've had maybe 4 or 5 boxes. So they didn't get the weather sealing correct where the seal type enters the box, and so they use these just extra thick seals that they had to buy kind of aftermarket and retrofit, and so there weren't a lot of thread left over in some of the boxes, and so we've had a couple where the seal types actually popped out. They've had to go back and, but that's just an installation quality problem, right? Really important to ride the installers. You got to be really on top of it and inspecting everything at every step. Okay, we're doing something pretty cool from a security perspective. So on the, as I said, there's Xfinity, Wi-Fi, and then obviously we have the usual complement of secure vendors. So if you are a fan, you're going to, sorry this is so washed out here, but basically if you pull up your phone, you're going to see 2 SSIDs. You come out here and through the firewalls and up. We are running a flat VLAN, so it's a /16 for the fans, which again ties back to the 65K target for the users, and it runs great. We've got broadcast multicast control at both edges, right, at the radio and on the uplink, so we're able to manage that pretty well. And then if you are a secure user, so I talked about airtime at length yesterday, and I said I'd sort of become monomaniacal about it. So I do all kinds of things that fundamentally are from the perspective of recovering airtime. And beacons are an obvious target for that. So we took a position, and the 49ers were great about backing this up. We said, look, first of all, no third-party APs in the building, right? I cannot afford to have misconfigured stuff that has really 1 megabit rates on 2.4 and 6 meg rates on 5 gig and doing other stupid stuff. So I don't want to deal with that problem. So if you need Wi-Fi, you got to come through the team, right? So that was kind of step one. The next step, or the next piece of it was we said no pre-shared keys, 0 pre-shared keys. As far as I'm concerned, PSKs are a 20th century security solution. They're fundamentally actually not that secure. And I think every hacker worth their salt in the country knows that fan TM is the ticket master, network at any venue, right? So we wanted to kind of get some security through obscurity and so on, but fundamentally, I wanted to get rid of all the PSK, all the separate vendor-specific secure networks that were in the environment. So that meant we needed to run a converged .1x network, which then had some implications for all of the clients that were in that environment, right? So we had to work with the ticketing vendors and the folks making the new hardware, as well as all the backup scanners that Ticketmaster had on site, the point of sale vendors, and so on, to make sure that you have to support 5 gigahertz because the secure network is only on 5 gig. You have to support DFS because we're running all the channels, and you need a supplicant, right, so that you can, and we need to test that you can actually authenticate through the system. So we went through that diligence phase with each of the folks that needed to be on the network. And it's pretty cool where we ended up. The original concept was just get the airtime back, right? But it's turned out to be super convenient for a lot of users. And I'm sharing this with you because I personally think this is the security model for LPVs going forward. We should all be doing this. So just to walk you through a couple of use cases. So we've got a ClearPass cluster here, which is just the name for our particular AAA server environment. And with all these systems, we can proxy to various other kinds of back-end systems. So if you are a 49ers user, there's a Active Directory server in another data center. So we're just joined to that domain. You log in with your standard credentials, and boom, you're on the network, right? And I drop you in a 49ers role and a 49ers subnet that's isolated from everybody else. If you are a ticketing device, you come in and, what we did here is obviously we're not going to set up per scanner credentials in a .1x environment, right? That's part of the reason people use pre-shared keys is that you have a lot of devices that change hands, right, or that are never going to be associated with specific people, and so you wouldn't do that. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So we replicated the PSK experience in the .1x context just by doing static IDs and passwords, right? So there's a user ID, ticket, let's say, with a static password, and that's provisioned down here directly in ClearPass. And then we've paired MAC authentication with it, and we built portals so that each of the vendors, so basically what the team is responsible for the act of authenticating you, but the data behind it and that enables the logic is actually maintained by each individual vendor. So the ticketing vendor, for example, has a portal where they do all their own MAC address authentication. So we're ultimately not liable for somebody getting into the network through their system. We're just basically the ticket taker, if you want to think of it that way. And then Santa Clara Police and Fire was originally planning to bring in a bunch of their own APs from another vendor and throw them in a few places in the jail and whatnot. And of course, we said no third-party APs. And besides, why would you want to limit yourself to just, your guys are all over, right? And gals, why would you want to, just have coverage in these places? And they're going to run, tunnels back to their data center to some other controller. So it turns out that Santa Clara had a federated Active Directory already built for external integration. So we just joined ClearPass to their domain, and it works just like it does for the 49ers. So they come in with their usual creds and they get on their devices and they have the whole stadium now, which is pretty cool. And then, once the stadium went live, we came out of the woodwork, and of course, it's a new building, so every system is IP, right, IP-based. So the elevator people wanted to hit their systems. The Sony guys wanted to hit all their TVs. The building controls guys wanted. So we've provisioned additional. There's a building controls VLAN, there's an IPTV VLAN, and so on. And so for those people who do have discrete people, right? So we did set up per user credentials in the AAA server here. So it's a pretty rich functionality. It's very convenient for folks. But again, the starting point for the whole thing was I'm just protecting my bowl, right? I'm just trying to reduce airtime consumption, and it's really working very, very well.
Are you using static IPs or public IPs or private?
On the NAT, on the upstream, or? So it's a NATed. The question is, are public or private IPs? So it's a NATed environment, and there's I think there's 64 addresses on the WAN that are externally facing, and then
Where are you doing NAT?
the /16, it's a 10 net.
Where are you doing the NAT?
The NAT. The question is, where is the NAT?
On the controllers or on the Brocade?
We are not doing, the controllers are L2, so our standard, and a lot of what I'm showing you is straight out of our design guides. I mean, there's not really secret sauce in some of this. So we don't normally want to be the default gateway in large networks. We want to have the right tool for each individual job. So, and also from a security perspective, I don't want to have an L3 presence on any fan-facing, networks. So we are just L2 here, and then it's not really shown here, but there's a separate Brocade device. They're using the Brocade ADX product, which is doing the NAT-PAT. So the firewalls are actually the Junies I showed you earlier are literally just policy enforcers. They're not doing the NAT. Okay, so here is the public SSID configuration, and sorry, yeah.
Plans for V6?
Yes.
V6?
Oh, no, there's no V6. We said no. They didn't want to deal with it either. And in general, I'm not a fan. Yeah, unless you have a specific requirement for it. And some of our higher ed customers are running large V6 environments, so we have to deal with it. We have full V6 support. I mean, we can go there, but just from a network traffic perspective, it's not. There's a lot of additional chattiness. Yes.
Charlie's doing a thing on V6 tomorrow.
Yeah, so you should come to his session and we can kind of give you the update. V6 has been, the support and the issues, I think as customers have been deploying it, vendors have been getting a better handle around what some of the issues are and so on, and then we've been responding with features and so on. So there's kind of a loop that, I think the vendor and customer community are going through right now. But it's there if you need it, but if you don't need it, you shouldn't run it. You don't, why incur all that traffic cost? So we start, sorry, was there? Okay, so basically it's the same configuration I showed you yesterday, except I think we have all I showed you, we only had 24 in the lab. The reason for the delta here is that we want to have one additional TX rate below the basic rate, which helps for roaming. If this was 24 and 24, my client could get a little further out and not be able to talk, but not be in the next cell yet. You can see we're not running any B rates whatsoever. We did, out of an abundance of caution, run with an 11 meg basic rate in the list here for the first couple of games, just in case there were any compatibility issues. But we took that out and ran the rest of the season without it. So obviously, you saw this earlier. We had to increase the client count on the radio. This is a feature we call multicast rate optimization. So basically, it dynamically, for multicast traffic that does make it out, and we do allow certain things through the filter, this will basically force the rate to be the highest rate that's available in the cell. Beacon rates. You'll notice they're slightly different, and so we're running a little lower rate here, and the reason is that, interestingly, Devin talked about propagation yesterday. We're actually seeing worse propagation on 2.4 than 5 gig in this environment, so originally this was 24 and 24, and we needed to drop it. And then this is a feature we have, local probe request. So basically, if your SNR is below that, we will not respond to your probing. So it's just try to reduce some of that chattiness that happens on the air. And then we are advertising. So I've run most of the season with this. This is something we do in enterprise environments. And some of the mobile operating systems do respect the QBSS load. So I don't really have data on effectiveness, but it hasn't gotten us into any trouble. And I think it's just helpful to try to get these devices to go to the right place. Then we have what we call a virtual, so that's the SSID profile. This is the virtual AP profile. The two relevant things here, this is how we're doing the broadcast multicast enforcement. I just have a blanket drop, and then we have certain features in our system will create sort of pinholes, smart pinholes through the filter, so we can pass specific kinds of traffic. But this is great. And because we're not doing multicast video, I can get away with this. If the 49ers had decided to use multicast video for their application, you would see a slightly different configuration here. But this is the optimal one. I don't need to. This really cleans up the air tremendously. This is how we deny peer-to-peer traffic at L2. I have bonded channels disabled. This is something else I'm doing. I consider it experimental, but we're not running SGI. Since it's an outdoor venue, we ran most of the season with SGI disabled. I'm going to flip it. I'm going to take these out actually going into next season, and we'll run it the other way. I'm pretty happy with the numbers we got, but it's an outdoor channel model, right, in a fairly large environment. Yeah, Chris? I'm sorry? Yes. Yeah, the question is there a trade-off between, or what is the trade-off? Is that? Yeah, so the trade-off is robustness for speed, basically, right? So because it's a big environment and I've got some amount of bounce, right, my delay spreads could be longer, and so I could have intersymbol corruption. So I might have more retries with the short guard, and so this is a sort of an abundance of caution. but it means that my guard intervals are twice as long, right? So I can't get the highest rates in the cell. And then we are running with airtime fairness, which is a standard recommendation for us in these environments. It does a nice job, particularly for the downstream traffic. There is some indirect shaping of the upstream flow as well. Okay, stats.
Chuck, before you move on, you were talking about the 2.4 earlier.
Yeah.
And you have the beacons in there.
Yes.
Have you seen or do you have any data on the impact of the beacons to Pico?
Yeah, great question. So Daryl's asking, what about the Bluetooth beacons? Particularly because there's a lot of them in that environment. So we did a lot of work on this. I personally did a lot of work on it because I was pretty worried, and I didn't know a lot. I don't know if you haven't had time to look into Bluetooth 4.0. There's a bunch of great guides on the net. You can drop me an email later. I can send you some. So it's pretty intelligently designed. This whole beacon functionality, and some of you may know, but probably most of you don't, they've rechannelized the 2.4 band for Bluetooth 4.0. And so the channel widths, instead of being a meg, are 2 megahertz. And they have set aside, so there's 40 of them, 40 channels, right? And of the 40, 3 channels are reserved for what are called advertising, or what Apple called beacons, essentially. So when you hear beacon, that means that these 3 channels are one of these 3 channels is being broadcast every so many milliseconds with a certain code on it, right? And that's what the device picks up. So those 3 channels, one is at the very bottom of the band, it's about 2400. One is at the top of the band, around 2480. And the 3rd channel is smack in the middle between Wi-Fi 1 and 6. So on paper, it looks okay. And the transmit power, the IRP of the Bluetooth radios runs from basically minus 10 to about plus 10. And we're running at, I think, at 0, I want to say. So the range is reduced, but it's also a narrow band, right? So there's all these kind of interesting effects. But the net, I've looked at it, there is almost 100% duty cycle on those 3 little 2 meg chunks in the band, but it's not causing us any headaches. I was skeptical, but I'm a convert. Yeah. In fact, we're putting there's some new functionality, and we're actually, so there'll be Bluetooth beacons embedded. I think some of the vendors have announced this, right? So you can actually embed these things in the APs and use them to manage the Bluetooth networks. Okay, stats. So before I get into my stats, I just wanted to sort of give a tip of the hat. There's a bunch of folks in here that have done venues. It's a little smaller than I'd hoped for, but so I keep a tracker. There's a bunch of numbers in the public domain that have been in news stories and vendor presentations and stuff like that. This is, as you know, this is the highest of the high wire acts there's no other network design job that's like this, where you can read about yourself in the newspaper the next day if it sucks, right? You know, for the folks that have done these, they are really special experiences, and it's remarkable if you look at, so this is Super Bowl, the last 3 Super Bowls, the World Cup here in Brazil, World Series at AT&T Park. We got a little friendly crosstown rivalry going on with the Giants. And then since I know my friends from Extreme are here, there were some numbers that came out, about a week ago that I put here for the Panthers game. So what's interesting, a number of things, I mean, so as an architect, I'm so grateful for the fact that people are starting to share numbers, because like a year ago, like everybody was just, you know, tight-lipped about how their networks were performing. But it is a confidence building measure in the extreme to have some sense of how, you know, what to expect from other venues. And then if you know a little bit about the designs, you know, were they overhead, were they handrail, were they whatever, you can actually look at these numbers and begin to infer how different kinds of designs perform, right? What is the envelope that I could expect in a different type of a venue? So it's I think it's a tremendous service to everyone in this room and beyond that's actually responsible for these systems. We need to be exchanging more information. But when I look, you know, from Super Bowl 46, right, 400 gig right, to 3.2 terabytes last year. And I didn't have time to check this morning. Is the number out? I don't think it's public yet. Okay. Anyway, so we're anxious to hear what this was. And I think AT&T Stadium has this record now from the College Bowl of 4.7, which is really a fantastic number. Congratulations. So it's just interesting to see that progression. But I just want to recognize, so the folks, and I won't get into vendor names here, but obviously certain vendor and service provider were responsible for most of these networks. Big progression in the technology. This is the World Cup in Brazil. Huge associated user count here. 770 megabits peak speed, which is a good speed for that design. And then the World Series set some, so that if those of you don't know the backstory, so the network at AT&T Park has been redesigned and improved many times over the years. They hit 47.9% of associated capacity this year. Of the 49% of the seating capacity actually was on the network, which is just, I think that's the highest number I've ever seen. And at 1.6 terabytes out of that group of people, which for baseball is fantastic. And then you guys beat Super Bowl 48, right? Just at the Seahawks new network up at CenturyLink Field. All of these numbers beat the Super Bowl last year, right? So just fascinating to see the progression of the design. And who would have thought, right, a few years ago that Wi-Fi could even stand up to this kind of load. So it's a huge tribute to everybody that has really slogged through the trenches on this and done the work with the features and so on. So let me add some Levi's numbers up here. So we've set a few records of our own, I think anyway. I only have what's in the press, right? Our high watermark this year, we had just shy of 30,000 users, about 40, not quite 42% of seating capacity for unique users. And the number you can't quite see for the season, the average was 35%. And unlike these guys, which are all huge games, playoff games, so the average traffic volume, if you don't know, for a playoff game is almost twice or higher a regular season game. And this seems to be true in virtually every sport. Doesn't matter what it is, hockey, baseball, football. Unfortunately, we didn't have such a good finish this year. We didn't make the playoffs. And I was really looking forward to seeing what the network could do. So these are regular season numbers as compared with, obviously playoffs. We peaked at 3.1 gigabits per second in the Bears game in September. And my average peak is 1.91 gigabits per second. And we'll get into a little bit about peak versus average. I'll show you some charts here in a second. I believe those are records. We moved 3.3 terabytes, which I believe is a record for a non-playoff game. And we've moved, for this season, we've moved about a little over 23 terabytes from start to finish. And if you roll in, there have been 5 non-NFL events, so we've moved almost 30 terabytes in the 15 events that have taken place since the venue opened. And then I've coined a new metric, and you'll see in a second when I show you the chart over a game. This network hits a gigabit per second about half an hour before kickoff, and more or less doesn't come back down until fourth quarter. So I've got this new metric, which is sort of the amount of time that the network is continuously above either a gig or 500 meg. And so for the season, we spent 21 and a half hours at 1 gigabit or higher continuously, right? Which I think is, the reason I think that's interesting is it goes to the stability of the design and the ability of the network to sort of, how elastic is the demand versus the capacity. And then the last thing I wanted to point out is, again, a lot of numbers floating around, different venues, different sizes, different sports, different, is there some way to sort of normalize the performance across all these venues and try to draw some common conclusions? The metric for me that seems to work best is I create, you could do the average data per fan, right? Just take the unique users into the data offload and you get a number, and you can sort of see that progression that I was talking about. So we move about 100 meg per fan on average per event, and I think that's characteristic of that design. You see something similar at AT&T Park, which also has a Pico type of design to it. So again, the architect in me is trying to divine, what I can, how to de-risk projects, right, by trying to understand what the expected capacity or expected performance might look like. Performance is pretty consistent across the season, so you can see the red bars are, and the percentages are unique users, and then these are the peak concurrent. So we were in the mid 20,000 range for unique, and this is the 2 gig line here, so you can see pretty much every game we were north of 2 gig. The blue line is that data per fan number I was just talking about, and you can see it's kind of been trending up as the year went along. They were rolling out new features in the app and so on. So pretty good numbers from that perspective. This is what I was talking about with stability under load. So very hard to read on here. The scale, this line here is 2 gig, right? So this is 0, 2 gig, 4 gig, and this red line is 1 gigabit per second. The blue and the green, so the blue is downstream and the green is upstream. So that's telling you that the 2 big peaks we had, so this is kickoff, right, and this is third quarter. The 2 big peaks were upload dominated, and that's pretty consistent now. We see a huge amount of that going on. People are taking photos and videos and what have you, and then the network has to catch up. This line here is the Xfinity Wi-Fi public SSID. This was the 3.1 gigabit per second peak. And that was just 3.1 gig on that SID. The other, the press and the other SIDs would add a little bit to that. But you can see that basically this is about 30 minutes before kickoff, maybe a little more, and we were above a gigabit per second for virtually the whole duration, right? So the network performance is very, very stable, and it's not spiky. We cross-correlate everything, so this is the WAN uplink data off the router at the same time, and you can see the numbers agree. And also, we're looking at the interface stats on the controllers. We tunnel everything, so our frames go to the controller. So the controller loads are 2x, right? The open air load and the uplink load, right? Because of the hairpin through the controller. And that's what's, of course, driving the bandwidth in the spikes. Couple different games, right? So we talked about 3.3 terabytes, but it's been very stable. The average is just right around 2 TB, as I mentioned. Band loading. So we've had really, really good, one of the things, one of my jobs as a RF architect is to get the clients, do everything in my power to get the clients to go to 5 gig and get them where I want them to be. If I can get that client to self-steer, right, then that's a problem I don't need to worry about from an infrastructure perspective. So we've done a bunch of different things to try to make that happen. And it's really reflected in the numbers here. So for this game 5 here against the Chiefs, right, so 2,000 clients on 2.4 versus almost 5,000 clients. So it's more than 2 to 1 on 5 gig. So the first controller is the lower bowl. The second controller is the upper bowl, if you want to think of it that way. So again, not quite 2 to 1 here, almost over 4 to 1 for the indoor spaces, about 2 to 1 on the plaza areas. So this is really key to the design is getting the antennas in the right place. And basically what you want to do is make the 5 gig band look really attractive to the mobile device. You want it to actually look more attractive than the 2.4 network. So we do things to sort of make the 2.4 kind of, less sexy, if you will, from a device perspective, and it's pretty effective. Steady loading on all the controllers. Again, this is the lower bowl controller. This is the upper bowl controller. So this was the peak in game 5. That peak was 1.81 gigabits per second as measured by the controllers, which are a 1-minute average. So all the other numbers I've been giving you are off of our Airwave system, which is a 5-minute average. The peaks are actually higher than that. The Airwave peak for this was 1.6 gig, so about 200 megabits less. But so you can see at this moment in the bowl, I was doing almost 1.4 gig just there, right? And another 400 meg in other places.
How did you measure your effectiveness of whether the clients were even 5 gig capable versus if they just were choosing not to go to 5 gig?
Yeah, so the question is, how do I know the effectiveness of my steering if there's a 5 gig capable client that chooses not to go? So we have tables. You can run commands to look at basically the steerable clients. But fundamentally, it comes down. We were kind of talking a little bit about CLI versus GUI before. What I'm ultimately interested in is the band split, right? This is I really have to kind of pull the lens back and look at it at a macro level. And I know that I can't fix every single device. So as long as in the aggregate, it's the trend is clear, then I'm happy. Right.
You can keep your 2.4 at a level for those 2.4 only clients.
Yes.
They have acceptable performance.
Correct.
Make the 5 look that much better.
Exactly. Yeah, we make 5 look better. Yes.
I'm just curious, do you have 2.4 enabled on every AP?
Yeah, question is, do we have 2.4 on every AP? The answer is yes. And pretty good with a Pico design, you have to, but because you're doing very tight cells, right? So there would be if you did not, you would have holes in your coverage.
So wouldn't you expect more split ratio?
More split.
Ratio.
Yeah. So the question is, wouldn't you expect more 50-50? No, you do not have to accept that. So that is what we see in some other networks, but there are things you can do from a radio design and a configuration perspective to push that number a lot higher to 5 gig.
So you're closer to 80%, right?
I'm almost 80% exactly in a number of cases. Yeah.
Do you use band steering or it's just based on the power?
It's a combination of techniques. So we have a feature called Client Match, which does some of it. There are things that I do in terms of how I place the antennas. There are things we do from a power management perspective.
You not decline, not responding to the probes from the workflow, right?
Yeah, so I'm going to ignore probes that are weaker than 10 dB. But you should. My point is, you should look at this in your own designs, and there's gold there, right? If you dig into it. A little bit about the application breakdown. So you see this Amazon. Amazon is always the biggest application. That's because the 49ers app is hosted at Amazon. But then we have lots of other, cloud traffic, and it varies a little bit from controller to controller. The top apps, right? So Google, Facebook, Apple. This is iTunes or iCloud. Snapchat over here. So pretty heavy usage. Facebook is usually right up there in the top 3 or 4 applications. Okay, Picocell, I've just got a couple minutes left. Yeah. So that's the structure of a Picocell filtered at neg 65 with the AP at the 50-yard line in one of the seat sections. And this is what it looks like in 3D, so you can kind of, get that sense of the exponential nature of radio decay.
This is without people in the seats?
Yes, this is without, there's no bodies present for this. Which, that's what it looks like filtered. Here's what it looks like unfiltered, right? So, and this is just the lower bowl. And here's the upper deck of that same AP, all the way up in the nosebleeds. Now I'm at 20 dBm or 23 dBm EIRP, right? But one AP, like Devin, I showed the example yesterday, right? One AP lights this whole place up, right? So So that really becomes the challenge, is how do I manage that? What should my power levels be on the APs, on the different radios, and then what is my crowd going to do, right? This entire design is based around having a crowd seated. But this is really the key thing I wanted to share with you. So we've done tons and tons of testing. By now I do a fair amount of testing. So we put a bunch of engineers. So I basically lit up 11 sections with test devices, and we put a Chariot server on site. And we put a phone, a tablet, and a laptop here. And then we also had a capture laptop to look at cross-bowl packet flow. And we baselined individual sections. So this is just some of the phone data. So we get a Galaxy S4, a one-stream smartphone in a 20 meg channel should get about 60, 65 megabits per second TCP, which is what we find. So we did 8 sections in the lower bowl, and then I did 1 section each going vertically to sort of look at the verticality of the coverage. And then we did, so those were the single section tests, and then we did multi-section tests, right? And a lot of numbers here, but basically the way you read it, this is the throughputs, and then the X is the multiple of the single station throughput, right? So X is about 65 megabits per second, give or take. So you can see across the bowl here, we were getting 1.4X, 1.1X, which means that these cells are interfering with each other, right? Again, yeah, there's no crowd present whatsoever in here. And then we ramped it up. We did 3 sections, 4 sections, 6 sections, and you can see how it does increase a little bit, right? With 4 section tests, I'm at 1.4x, 6 sections, I'm at 1.7. So we are getting, there are tiny moments in time where 2 cells are able to go at the same time, but in general, there's virtually no or very limited spatial reuse in this environment when it is empty. Another way we looked at it is these are packet counts. So again, I've got a capture machine at each of these locations. The numbers in these boxes are the number of packets that were generated locally, and then these are the frames that from here that were heard over here and vice versa. And so it's interesting. I mean, you definitely do see some reduction, actually a pretty significant reduction in frames across. But that reduction is, even with the stuff that makes it across, it's enough to bring those numbers way, way down and take away the reuse. So, and again, we would expect the control and the management traffic to go further, right? Even ignoring the preamble. But this is the champagne chart. This is the big one I'm trying to get to. So this is full. And so the blue bars are the data I was just showing you, and then the red and the green bars are with a crowd. And the number of lines here is the number of sections in the test. And and the number here is the reuse multiple. And so with these 2 section tests, we were getting 1.3. With full, we get a full 2.0 reuse. 3 section tests, about 2.8. 4 sections, like so. And then almost 6 with the 6 section test. And then the last game, we went all the way. We said, okay, let's go all 11 sections. And we got almost 10x, reuse with the Pico. So this is part of what is powering the numbers that we're getting out of the venue. And this is the first really, truly definitive data I've got that shows that this is really why the Pico, if you can afford it, because it's expensive, and it's hard to retrofit, right? So this is not really something that is easy to do in existing construction. But if you can afford it, this is really kind of one of the fundamental properties of that design. And I think, out of time. We can talk, if you want, offline about some of the lessons learned. But basically, just to summarize, the Pico worked, DFS worked, the .1x thing worked really well, the flat VLAN worked really well. I need more time to sort of explain some of the other stuff. We did a lot of tuning, we added APs and so on. They didn't want field coverage originally, so we added that back. But anyway, all in all, pretty good deployment and lots of things to improve on for next time. So thank you.